So in this video, we're going to take a look at the basics of inflation. And a lot of this is terminology. So this kind of stuff in here, I would encourage you maybe to make a couple of flashcards for these kinds of things so that you have a handy way of studying some of the terms. But we'll go through them and hopefully try to explain some of what's going on here with inflation. So at the very basic level, it's price levels. And this is the idea of saying not just one good. So if the price of donuts goes up, then that doesn't mean inflation happened. It's the price level of all the different goods and services, or many of the goods and services in an economy that people buy. So we would say that it's the entire society. It's not necessarily just one particular good. Now, there are three terms to know about when it comes to price levels. The first is inflation, the second is disinflation, and the third is deflation. And they each have very different meanings. Now, inflation just means that price levels are increasing. This has the effect of decreasing the purchasing power of money. What that means is that your dollars do not buy as much as they used to. So this would be equivalent to a positive inflation rate, right? A positive inflation rate. That's what that means. Now, disinflation actually just means a reduction in the rate of increase of inflation. That means that we went from maybe 8% to 3% inflation. So it's still positive, right? Still positive. But we went from, boy, that 8's kind of wonky there. Cattywampus 8. We went from 8 to 3, so we brought the inflation rate down. And that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes the goal of policymakers is to reduce inflation. If it gets too high, we're going to see some consequences. The third term to know is deflation. And this is a decrease in price levels. So this would actually be the idea of, we're going to put a little negative inflation rate. Oh boy. Now, when we rate things of like good to bad, right, we can actually say pretty clearly that actually the worst possible thing in the world is deflation. And that's because it increases the purchasing power of money. Now, that might seem like a good thing at first until you realize it's going to really harm businesses. So think about a business that has bought stock that they plan on selling. And, things that go on the shelves, I should say, stock, right? Things that go on the shelves. And they plan on selling it for $5 a piece. And so they've bought it for $4 a piece. They bought it from their supplier. And they go, okay, we're going to make $1 profit on each one of these, right? Okay, good. And then deflation happens. Now the price levels are falling, so they're going to have to cut the prices. If they cut prices, that's going to cut into their profit. What happens if they can't sell it for $5? They can only sell it for $3. Well, they either can take a loss on every single unit, or they just shut their doors. And in either case, it's not good for the economy. The next thing you know, the person who works in that store is going to be laid off. And then, as soon as that person's laid off, well, they're not going to go buy something else. And that reduces the demand for goods and services. And what we'll find is that price levels would fall even more. So this is kind of a deflationary spiral. It's a bad spiral. So if we were to rank, right, worst, we could say worst is deflation. That's like really bad, really bad, really bad. That's Great Depression, right? In the Great Depression, deflation happened, and that was really bad for people. And then a really close second, right? A close second bad would be something that sometimes gets called hyperinflation, right? And in history class, you might have learned about Germany and the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, or perhaps you learned about Hungary in the 1940s, or Zimbabwe only about 10 years ago. There are lots of countries that have had hyperinflation crises. There isn't a hard and fast definition for it, but what that just means is really high inflation. And when we say high inflation, I don't mean 10%, 20% a year, although that can be very painful levels at 10 or even 20% a year of prices going up by that much. We're talking thousands of percents or millions of percents increase in the prices of goods and services. That's what we mean when we talk about hyperinflation. And the effect of that is to not only just decrease the purchasing power of money by that amount, but it makes your money essentially worthless. And so hyperinflation can destroy people's life savings, right? If you've saved $100,000 and then all of a sudden $100,000 will buy you a loaf of bread, well, you could see how hyperinflation would be very damaging. So both of these are kind of very bad, very bad. So you would need, if you had a hyperinflation situation, you would need some sort of disinflationary method, right? Some way to reduce the rate of increase of inflation, to bring that back from 10,000% down to something more manageable. Now, just in terms of targets, right? What's a goal? Policymakers usually focus on stable prices. You don't want lots of fluctuation. And the Fed actually has an announced clear target of 2% inflation every year. So the goal is actually price levels should go up about 2%. Now, why 2? That's a little strange, right? Some people would say, why wouldn't you target 0? Well, you don't target 0 because that's awfully close to deflation. So we target 2 because it gives us a little bit of buffer in case things start to go unwell, right? If it falls a little bit, if it goes to 1.7 or 1.3, it's not the end of the world, right? We have some room for us to be able to get us out of that and boost inflation up a little. But we don't want to start at 0 because then we're too close to deflation. Now, let's talk about some of the consequences, right? We've got costs of inflation and some impacts here. So as purchasing power decreases, this is going to be the wages effect on this. What we find is that workers usually will demand a raise. So as inflation goes up, workers say, I need a raise to keep up with inflation. And then lenders will respond by also charging higher interest rates. Because if I loan you money for a year at a 2% interest rate, and the inflation rate is 2%, so at the end of the year you have to pay me back my original amount plus 2% interest. If the inflation rate's 2%, when you give me the money back, I can buy the exact same amount that I could with the original money. So I didn't actually earn any interest. The real rate of interest was 0. So usually lenders are going to charge an interest rate that's above the inflation rate, right? And to keep up with changes in the inflation rate, you'll often see them raise or lower interest rates. Now, real wages and real interest rates, here's that kicker, right? They tend to remain constant in the long run. Usually they remain constant, but the rate that gets charged to people will actually change, but the real rate will stay the same. And that's because nominal wages, that is to say, the ones that are just what the sticker says, right? This is how much your wage is. And nominal interest rates, in other words, the rate that you get charged on the bill, those are going to change along with price levels. So that would be like saying if inflation, right? If inflation goes up by 2%, then we would expect the interest rate nominal to go up by 2%. The nominal interest rate would go up by 2%. So that the lender gets to keep, there's no change in the real interest rate. And that's a lowercase I and a little sub r. So oftentimes we'll see nominal wages and nominal interest rates will be adjusted so that they change along with a change in a price level. And because of rising price levels being kind of matched by these, most economists would say that long-run price levels usually have pretty neutral economic impact. That in the long run, the level of prices doesn't really matter. And if we actually have pretty stable levels of prices, even if it's stable and positive, like 2% increase year after year after year, if that's predicted and expected, then people will build that in, right? They'll say, okay, you get a 2% automatically. You get a 2% wage rate increase, and we're going to raise interest rates, and we'll keep them kind of along with that. So we often will see that people will try to keep these real interest rates constant, and they'll keep real wages constant. Now, if, though, the rate changes unexpected, if it becomes unexpectedly high or low, then we do have costs that are not neutral. They hurt people or they help people. So, for example, if we had a wage contract that said you're going to get 2% a year increase nominally, and inflation goes from whatever it was to 5%, then it actually means that your real wage is going to decrease by 3%. So one rule of thumb that we can use here is actually just to say that the nominal, right, minus the inflation gives us the real. And you can kind of use that as a quick way of figuring out what's the real rate, or if you knew what the inflation rate and the nominal rate is, you could figure out the real rate. Likewise, we would see that if there's higher inflation and you were on a fixed income, let me straighten that there a little bit. If I said I pay you $10,000 every year, well, over time, higher inflation rates are going to erode your ability to buy stuff. So it'll hurt fixed incomes. A loan is another way to think about this. If I'm charging you a nominal interest rate of 3% and inflation is 2%, that means the real interest rate is 1%, right? So it's nominal minus inflation is the real. Any rise in inflation would allow me to, as the borrower, pay the money back with dollars that are worth less than they were when I borrowed them. So a rise in inflation would help me as a borrower and would hurt a lender. And likewise, a decrease in inflation would hurt the borrower and help the lender. That's something to think about there. So there's an impact on wages and interest rates if we have different inflation rates. Now, there's specific also costs of inflation that accrue regardless of whether there's kind of these aspects here. These are shoe leather, menu, and unit of account costs. And so if we have inflation, we're going to experience these types of things. Now, ideally, you want to keep inflation low, 2% or so a year, and stable. And then you don't really see these as much. So for example, let me explain each one. Shoe leather means that if you have very high inflation rates, it's going to mean that people have to conduct their transactions fast before their money isn't worth what they thought it was. So people are constantly running around comparing, they're constantly, running around trying to get more money to hire, to deal with the demand for this sort of thing. And it becomes costly in terms of their time and effort, right, of dealing with this higher prices. And that's why we call it shoe leather, because they wear out their shoes. People wear out their shoes running from one store to the next, buying something before it becomes more expensive. Now, obviously, that would happen a lot more in a hyperinflation crisis than in a normal. Menu costs. So menu costs are literally like the cost of changing the prices on a menu, right? Think about that. The name comes from menu. So if it's constantly higher prices, then it's going to take time and work and effort to change the prices on all these menus. And we don't just mean restaurant menus, we mean prices of all kinds of goods and services. Lots of things are priced, and so if there's high inflation rates, it can be costly in terms of effort and time to change those prices to keep up with the inflation. The third is very abstract, and so this one's hard for students. But what I'd ask you to do is just for a second, in your head, think about how much does a car cost? Right? How much does a car cost? Or another way to think about it in your head, if it's not so much easy for you there, is to think about how much would a meal at McDonald's cost you, right? Think about that. And I bet in your head you pretty quickly could say, for a car between $15,000 and $35,000, right? Depends on the car, of course. But and a couple tens of thousands for a new car. And for a meal at McDonald's, maybe $8 or so, $7. It was relatively easy for you to make that estimation because we have a pretty close familiarity with how much a dollar will buy. Now, that's because we're using money as a unit, right? We're literally using it like a scientific unit. We're able to say, a dollar is worth about this much. If you have really high inflation, it makes it hard for people to do what you just did in your head, right? If you have too high of an inflation rate, then people can't easily know how much something's worth. So it makes efficiency, it decreases efficiency because people go, you know what? I don't know if the McDonald's meal is priced at $20 today, or is the McDonald's meal $50 today? I don't know. Is that a good price or is it a bad price? So we call that unit of account because we're using money as a unit to keep track of things. So these are the costs of inflation. They're kind of separate from the impact of inflation on wages and interest rates, although obviously those hurt and help people as well. Now, the last part of today is called price indices. And in this one, it's a value designed to measure price level changes. And we've already looked at one similar one. Technically, the GDP deflator is not a price index, but it's used in the same way. So if you remember, the GDP deflator was the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP times 100, and that gave us the deflator. And we used it to kind of analyze how much price levels were changing. You can do that with another index called the Consumer Price Index. There's another one for producers, and these are, by the way, these are an index, and they're created because pretty simply, in fact. The way they create them is they say, what's the current prices of a basket of stuff? And we're going to say a basket of goods. And I think about a basket literally like a shopping cart, right? A shopping cart of goods. And then we divide that by the same goods, the same basket, the same goods. We divide that by the prices of those goods, prices of the same basket in a base year. right? And so that's how we actually figured out the prices of the same basket of goods in a base year times 100 equals, we'll say, the CPI. And so what the CPI is tens of thousands of goods and services that are commonly purchased by consumers. And what they do is every year is they go, okay, how much did that basket of goods and services cost this year? Okay, so they say, okay, they buy this much meat and they have this many haircuts and they buy this much lettuce and whatever, and this is how much rent costs. And they go, okay, the total price, so let's kind of do an example. The total price for that current year, for 2020, the basket costs $15,000, right? $15,000. And now let's say, well, what did those, and we'll say it was that in 2020. And then we go, okay, how much was that basket in 2005, right? 2005, well, we might say the basket was only, the exact same stuff was only $5,000 in 2005. And so then we say, okay, well, that's 3 times 100 gives us a CPI value of 300. Okay, well, in the base year, 2005, it would be equal to 100. And in 2020, it's 300. So now we can quickly tell how much of price has risen since then. From this date to this date, prices, right, we have new minus old over the old. So we have 300 minus 100 over 100. And we find it's 200 over 100, so prices have gone up 200%, right? So that's how we can tell. It's a positive 200%. Now, I'm making up some numbers here, right? Prices haven't actually risen quite that much since 2005. But that's how we figure out what these things are as a price index. It's just the price of the basket of goods in the current year, the exact same stuff in the base year would have cost you this much, times 100 gives you the CPI. And that allows you to compare from one year to the next. Now, I will point out, it's exactly the same as these, right? A nominal GDP is the GDP in the current year's prices. And this is the exact same output of stuff, but in a base year's prices. So they're really calculated the same way, right? They're calculated the same way. This is just not technically a price index. So I know this was a lot. I hope that it helps you understand some of the basics of inflation, and I'll see you next time.